Okay, so you're here with us for a deep dive, and we try to make these, especially for you, someone who's really looking to understand what's happening in India, especially if you're, someone preparing for the UPSC exams.
That's right.
Today, we're going to be focusing on something pretty important, and it's something that's been in the news quite a bit recently.
Yeah.
And that's all of these petitions that are being filed in Indian courts about the approval and the administration of vaccines.
Yeah, and this is actually really relevant for anyone who's, studying for the UPSC exams, because this could come up in the mains exam.
Absolutely.
And maybe even in the prelims, too. So
yeah, for sure.
it's worth paying attention.
So we are going to be drawing our insights from an article that was published in The Hindu.
Yeah, it's a really good analysis.
And what we're going to try to do in this deep dive is kind of go beyond just the headlines.
Yes, it is.
And really look at, what are the core concerns that are driving these petitions.
Right.
So we're going to be talking about things like transparency and consent and, the systems for monitoring the safety of vaccines.
All the important stuff.
And, of course, the, always controversial issue of compensation
Right.
when it comes to vaccines.
Yeah, and it's important to remember, this isn't about being anti-vaccine or anything like that. This is about understanding the, legitimate questions that people are raising within our legal system.
Exactly. And to give you just a little bit more context right off the bat, these petitions that we're talking about aren't just about COVID-19 vaccines.
Right.
The Hindu points out that some of them also involve vaccines for things like rabies and rotavirus.
Yeah, which I think shows, that these issues are much bigger than just one vaccine or one disease.
Exactly.
This is about our whole national immunization program.
Yeah, absolutely. So with all that said, let's jump right in and try to, understand what's going on here.
Okay, sounds good.
So what exactly is prompting all of these legal challenges? Are these just isolated incidents, or do they point to like bigger systemic problems?
So that's actually a really interesting question. And I think the Hindu does a really good job of pointing this out.
Okay.
These petitions aren't really just part of that global anti-vaccine movement that you see sometimes,
Right.
which is often based on like misinformation and conspiracy theories.
Right.
It seems like a lot of these petitions are actually coming from people who have really genuine concerns
Okay.
about the safety of the vaccines and about, how transparent the whole process is
Right.
for approving and monitoring these vaccines.
Yeah. And that makes sense. I mean, transparency is key
Exactly.
in building trust. And if people don't trust the process, then that's a huge problem.
Absolutely. And, when you don't have that transparency, it kind of turns this whole process, which is supposed to be about protecting public health,
Right.
into something that people become suspicious of.
Yeah, for sure. So can you give us an example of, what kinds of concerns are being raised in these petitions?
Oh, yeah, definitely. So the Hindu talks about a petition that was filed in Kerala
Okay.
that actually ended up going all the way to the Supreme Court.
Wow.
And this petition was about people who had allegedly died
Oh, wow.
because of some kind of failure with the anti-rabies vaccine.
That's a very serious allegation.
Yeah, it is. And it really shows you that, people are concerned about whether these vaccines are actually working the way they're supposed to.
Right. And about the potential consequences if they don't.
Exactly. And, beyond that very specific case, the Hindu kind of identifies a few key themes that keep coming up in these different petitions.
Okay. What are those?
So one of the big things is people want to see more data from the clinical trials that are done for these vaccines.
Right. Because that's really the basis for deciding whether a vaccine is safe and effective.
Exactly. And then there are also concerns about whether the potential side effects of these vaccines are being communicated clearly enough to the public.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
And then, of course, there's the whole issue of what happens after someone gets vaccinated.
Right. Like, are we tracking that properly?
Exactly. So that's, what we call adverse event monitoring.
Uh-huh.
So are we really good at, tracking and investigating and responding when people have, unexpected health issues after they get vaccinated?
Yeah, that's super important.
Yeah. And then, of course, there's the whole question of compensation.
Right.
If someone does have a serious side effect from a vaccine,
Right.
Is there a clear and easy way for them to get compensated for that?
Yeah, that's often a really tricky issue.
Definitely.
So it sounds like people are raising some pretty serious questions about how the whole system works.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. And, the Hindu also talks about this, this decline in public trust in the CDSCO.
Right. And that's really important for, our listeners who are preparing for their UPSC exams.
That's for sure.
Because understanding the role and the perception of these regulatory bodies is crucial.
Absolutely.
So why is this erosion of trust in the CDSCO such a big deal?
Well, the CDSCO, or the Central Drug Standard Control Organization, if you want to use the full name,
Right.
they're basically the main authority in India when it comes to pharmaceuticals and medical devices,
Okay.
which of course includes vaccines. So they're the ones who are responsible for making sure that all the drugs and vaccines that are available in India meet, really strict standards.
Right, in terms of safety and efficacy and quality.
Exactly. So they're kind of like the guardians of, public health in that sense.
Yeah, that's a huge responsibility.
It is. And so when people start losing trust in an organization like that,
Right.
it can have some pretty big consequences.
Yeah, like people might be less likely to participate in, important public health programs.
Absolutely, like vaccination drives.
Yeah, exactly. And the Hindu points out that a lot of these petitioners are actually calling for independent committees to reevaluate the clinical trial data
Right.
instead of just relying on the CDSCO's assessments.
Which I think really shows, that people are losing confidence in the current system.
Right. They're basically saying that they don't think the oversight is strong enough or transparent enough.
Exactly. And unfortunately, some of the ways that people have responded to these concerns have actually made the problem worse.
Really?
Yeah. So the Hindu talks about how some vaccine manufacturers have filed defamation lawsuits
Oh, wow.
against people who've been critical of them.
Like, who are these manufacturers?
Well, the Hindu specifically mentions the Serum Institute and Farad Biotech,
Okay.
as you know, two major vaccine producers.
Right.
And the really worrying part is that in some cases, the courts have actually granted ex parte injunctions.
Ex parte injunctions? What does that even mean?
So basically it means that the court issued a legal order without even giving the person who's being sued a chance to defend themselves.
Oh, wow. So they don't even get to tell their side of the story.
Not initially, no.
That seems a little unfair.
Yeah, and it kind of sends the message that, if you raise any questions or concerns about vaccines, you might get sued.
Yeah. Which is going to make people even less likely to speak up.
Exactly. And the Hindu really emphasizes that, instead of resorting to these kinds of legal tactics,
Right.
we need to focus on finding policy solutions.
Yeah, solutions that actually address the concerns that people have.
Right. And that promote transparency.
For sure. So let's talk about transparency a little bit more.
Okay.
Because the Hindu points out that there are two key aspects of the vaccine approval process where transparency is really lacking.
Right.
So what are those areas?
So the first one has to do with the experts who are involved in approving vaccines.
Okay.
So the Hindu explains that the CDSCO does consult with, people who are called independent experts, but they don't actually tell us who these experts are
Oh, wow.
or whether they have any conflicts of interest.
So we don't even know their names.
Right.
That's kind of strange.
It is, and I think it just makes people more suspicious.
Yeah, for sure.
So the Hindu argues that if the government really wants to build trust,
Right.
they need to start by publishing the names of these experts
Okay.
and, tell us about their backgrounds and their affiliations.
Right. So we know who they are and where they're coming from.
Exactly. And even more importantly, they should release like transcripts or at least summaries of the discussions that these experts have.
Yeah. So we can see how they're actually making these decisions.
Right. And, that would really help to assure people that the process is fair and thorough.
Definitely. And what's the second area where transparency is lacking?
So the second area is about the data from clinical trials.
Okay.
So as it stands now, pharmaceutical companies have to submit all of that data to the CDSCO as part of the process for getting a vaccine approved. But then that data is basically kept confidential.
So the public doesn't get to see it.
No, and the Hindu argues that that's a big problem. Okay, they say that in order to have real transparency and accountability, the CDSCO should actually release all of that raw data.
Like the raw data from the clinical trials.
Yeah, and they should also release their own internal evaluations of that data.
Wow, that's pretty radical.
It is. But
Yeah.
I think their point is that, if we really want people to trust the system,
Right.
we need to let them see the evidence for themselves.
Yeah, so independent researchers and, the public health community can scrutinize it.
Exactly, of
Yeah.
course.
Yeah.
There's the issue of patient privacy.
Right, we don't want to release any sensitive personal information.
Exactly. And the Hindu acknowledges that. So they
Yeah.
suggest that, you could redact that information
Right,
to protect people's privacy.
yeah, that makes sense. So let's move on to another important issue that these petitions have raised. And that's the whole question of informed consent and how we monitor what happens after someone gets vaccinated.
Right.
So what does the Hindu have to say about those things?
Well, they make a really important point about informed consent,
Okay.
which is that in India right now, the legal requirement for informed consent
Mm-hmm.
really only applies to clinical trials.
Oh, I see.
It doesn't necessarily apply to like the general vaccination programs.
So when they're giving out vaccines to the general public,
Right.
they don't have to get informed consent.
Well, it's not as clear cut,
Oh.
and that's the problem.
So what's the difference between, informed consent in a clinical trial versus informed consent in a general vaccination program?
Well, the idea behind informed consent is that, before you agree to any kind of medical intervention,
Right.
you need to be given clear and complete information about what it entails.
Right, like the risks and the benefits.
Exactly. And you need to be able to understand that information.
Uh-huh.
And then you can decide for yourself whether or not you want to go ahead with it.
Right, and it sounds like that's not always happening with the general vaccination programs.
Yeah. And the Hindu is pretty critical of the way that information about vaccines is being shared with the public right now. So apparently the government is just putting this information on like obscure websites,
Oh, wow.
which obviously isn't very helpful.
Yeah, most people aren't going to see that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the Hindu argues that we need to be much more proactive about this.
Okay.
They say that information about vaccines, and especially about the potential side effects,
Right.
needs to be given to people directly at the vaccination centers.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
And it needs to be in a format that's easy for people to understand.
Right, so they can make an informed decision.
Exactly.
And what about the system for monitoring what happens after someone gets vaccinated?
Right.
So India has this system called the Adverse Event Following Immunization System, or AEFI.
Mm-hmm.
How well is that working, according to the Hindu?
Well, they say that it's not working as well as it should be.
Okay.
So apparently the guidelines for the AEFI system aren't actually legally binding,
Oh, wow.
which is a pretty big problem.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
if they're not legally binding, then what's to stop people from just ignoring them?
Right. And on top of that, the Hindu says that the guidelines aren't even being implemented very well.
Oh, wow. So even if they were legally binding, people still might not be following them.
Exactly.
But-
So their argument is that we need to create a much stronger system for monitoring the safety of vaccines.
Right. And that this system needs to be completely independent from the pharmaceutical companies.
Absolutely, because
Yeah.
we need to make sure that the data is being collected and analyzed in a way that's unbiased.
Yeah. And that if any safety concerns do come up, they're taken seriously.
Right.
So the whole issue of compensation is, obviously a really big one.
Yeah, it's a tough one.
So what's the current situation in India, according to the Hindu?
Well, they talk about this case, Saida v. Union of India,
Okay.
which was back in 2022. And in this case, the Kerala High Court actually ordered the government to come up with a policy
Okay.
for compensating people who had suffered severe side effects or even died
Wow.
from the COVID-19 vaccines.
That's a big deal.
It is, but the government appealed that decision to the Supreme Court. And so right now, it's kind of in limbo.
So we're still waiting to see what happens.
Yeah, exactly. And, the Hindu also raises this interesting question about who should be responsible for paying this compensation.
Right, because you could argue that it should be the government, since they're the ones who are running the vaccination program.
Right, but the Hindu says that from a legal standpoint, it actually makes more sense for the vaccine manufacturers to be the ones who are primarily responsible.
Oh, okay. That's interesting.
Because after all, they're the ones who developed and produced and sold these vaccines.
Right, and they're the ones who profited from them.
Exactly. So the Hindu argues that, if someone is harmed by a vaccine,
Right.
it's really the manufacturer who should be held liable.
Okay, but what about the government's role in all of this?
Well, the government might still have to pay some compensation,
Okay.
depending on, what kind of agreements they made with the manufacturers.
Like if they indemnified the manufacturers against these kinds of claims?
Exactly. But the problem is that we don't actually know what those agreements say.
Oh, because they're not public.
Right. There's a real lack of transparency there.
Yeah, that makes it hard to figure out, who's ultimately responsible.
It does. And the Hindu also mentions that some international vaccine manufacturers were actually hesitant to enter the Indian market during the pandemic.
Really, why is that?
Well, apparently it's because the Indian government wouldn't indemnify them.
Oh, so they were worried about being held liable for any side effects.
Exactly. And so because the foreign manufacturers weren't really involved,
Right.
the Indian manufacturers were able to kind of dominate the market
Uh-huh.
and make a lot of money.
And so the Hindu's argument is that because of that, they should also bear more of the responsibility.
Yeah. I think that's their point.
Okay, so looking ahead, what does the Hindu suggest we do about all of this?
Well, they make it pretty clear that, just relying on the courts to sort all of this out
Right.
is probably not going to be enough.
Yeah, it could take years for these cases to work their way through the system.
Exactly. And so the Hindu argues that we need to take a more proactive approach
Okay.
by focusing on policy and legislative solutions.
So what kinds of policies are they talking about?
Well, they say that the Ministry of Health needs to really step up and make some changes.
Okay.
And one of the big things they suggest is that we need a new law.
A new law about what?
A law that specifically addresses transparency in vaccine approvals
Okay.
and informed consent and adverse event monitoring.
So basically a law that codifies all of the things that we've been talking about.
Exactly. And they also say that, the health minister should really come out and, directly address the concerns that people are raising.
Yeah, that would be a good step towards rebuilding trust.
Absolutely. And, if we can make those changes,
Right.
it would not only increase public confidence in vaccines,
Right.
but it could also prevent a lot of unnecessary lawsuits.
Which would be good for everyone. So for our listeners who are, busy studying for their UPSC exams,
Right.
what's the key takeaway from all of this?
Well, I think the main takeaway is that all of these petitions that we're seeing about vaccines, they're not just random complaints.
Right.
They're actually pointing to some really fundamental issues
Okay.
with the way that vaccines are approved and administered and monitored in India.
Right.
And, understanding those issues is going to be important for your UPSC exams
Absolutely.
because they touch on all sorts of things like public health and governance and the role of the judiciary.
Yeah, and we've really gone in depth on those core issues today, haven't we?
We have.
Like the need for more transparency
Mhm.
and making sure that people are giving informed consent
Right.
and having a strong system for tracking side effects.
Yeah. And of course, the whole question of compensation.
Right. And, all of these things are really important for any democracy
Absolutely.
because they're all about maintaining trust between the government and the people. So I'll leave you with this thought.
Okay.
We've been talking a lot about how important public trust is,
Mm.
especially when it comes to something like public health.
Yeah.
So how do you think these challenges that we've been talking about,
Right.
these legal challenges and these policy challenges around vaccines,
Mm.
how do you think those are going to affect other public health initiatives in the future?
That's a good question.
And how are they going to affect, the overall way that India is governed?
Yeah, it's something to think about.
It's a big question. And, hopefully this deep dive has given you some things to think about,
Yeah, I hope so.
especially as you're preparing for your UPSC exams.
Definitely. And if you found this deep dive helpful,
Right.
please take a second to like and subscribe to our channel
Yes.
so you don't miss any of our future deep dives.
And we'd also love to hear your thoughts in the comments.
Yeah, tell us what you think.
And if you have any questions, feel free to ask. And just to remind everyone, this entire deep dive was based on reporting and analysis from The Hindu.
That's right.
So be sure to check out their work for more information.
Yes, definitely.
Thanks for joining us. See you next time. Bye.